So here we are to talk about another tragedy on so many levels. And I don't know how much you know, but I'll give you an update to where we are now. The suspect in this situation is identified as Lance Smith, male, black, 49 years old. And looking at his criminal history, he has no history, no contact with the police department whatsoever. So for many reasons, this is kind of an anomaly, although one family member reported, and I'll say this very carefully, that he may be suffering from some form of mental illness. But it was very loose. There's nothing to confirm that. Again, he has no criminal history, no contact with the department. First of all, let me just thank first the Detroit Police Department, 11th Precinct, certainly the command and executive team behind me who has been on this thing since about 10:30 last night. As you know, there was a call, 911 call, shots fired. The initial responding officers that arrived here, I had a chance to talk with each of the involved officers. So let me tell you what the victim profiles look like right now. Right now we can say that we have 2 confirmed dead, 1 possibly dead, 3 police officers shot. 1 is an off-duty DPS officer. Now the DPS officer was off-duty, lives in the neighborhood. He was the one that contacted 911 and was met by responding officers from the 11th Precinct. During this melee, the suspect fired a number of rounds, an unknown number of rounds, basically attacked first the civilian victims that resulted in a fatality, 2, and then begun firing on the off-duty DPS officer and responding DPD 11th Precinct officers. The way it was described to me by the officers involved, that it was actually 2 groups of incidents involving our police officers. We'll talk about the first group. The first group involved the off-duty DPS officer, 2 female victims that were shot fatally. DPD officers were pinned down by gunfire for at least an hour. And during that hour of time, they were waiting for the response of our special response team, who did a phenomenal job quickly getting in and safely moving out those who were shot, including those that were shot fatally. So I want to really thank the work that they've done. They stayed on this from about 10:30 last night until they were relieved at 05 this morning. The MSP was notified early. They have assumed the inner perimeter of this incident, and so that's the first. There was a second attack on our officers where we've learned that a second DPD officer was shot and was rescued by his partner and a few of the other officers. So there were a number of rescues facilitated throughout this incident. The main rescue effort, certainly, I think it was 9 officers that were pinned down by gunfire, 9 officers, and then which includes the off-duty DPS officer. And so fortunately, the officers, including the off-duty DPS, had minor injuries. One of our officers is still being treated in the hospital for his injury. It's expected he'll be released in the next day. The DPS officer should be released today, and then the 3rd DPD officer that sustained a gunshot wound has been released. And so that's where we're at. One additional thing, and this probably will come up in the question, during our SRT deployment, DPD, who had the inner perimeter, there were several deployments of gas, at least 3. We had several contacts with the suspect up to that point, the last contact being 2 o'clock this morning. It was just at the time we deployed our 3rd volley of gas. He didn't respond. The suspect was heard saying prior to and during this instance, "I will not be taken without a fight." So he clearly expressed an intention to do harm. He clearly expressed an intention to hurt police officers, and evidence of it was the number of police officers that were fired on and the fact that they were pinned down by gunfire for at least 1 hour. So with that, I'll take any questions that you might have.
Chief, you're waiting to have more contact with this man, or are you waiting to see if he's still there? Will there be, terms of knowing what you have in there, maybe he might have committed suicide. We don't know.
That's a possibility. There's a possibility that a third victim's inside. And so we're still working through that. Again, MSP has the inner perimeter. We're very thankful for them relieving our SRT assets. Without going into details on how we deal with these issues, but we are using technology to determine what's going on inside of the residence. And the next step will be that at the appropriate time we'll go in. But we have not had contact with this suspect since 2 o'clock this morning.
Chief, is anyone in custody at this point then, or?
We did take a neighbor into custody. It was believed at one time during this situation that he may have also been firing shots. A determination has been made that he was not firing shots. I did learn at the hospital from the DPS officer that he was the initial person reporting to the DPS officer that there was a problem, that shots were being fired. And the DPS officer didn't understand what that meant, was someone being robbed. He just responded, as well as the 2 other women.
So there were not 2 barricaded gunman situations?
No, it was actually 1. Initially, at some point, some of the responding officers believed shots were coming from 2 locations.
How many shots were fired?
We're not certain. We know that a number of shots. Suspect did have access to a rifle, but again, unknown shots. We know that again, our officers and the DPS officers were pinned down for at least an hour while shots were being fired. So anytime the officers tried to make a move to remove themselves from what we call the hot zone, he would begin firing.
And did Detroit police officers return fire as well?
No, at this point, there's no indication that any. They couldn't really tell where the shots were. They knew it was emanating out of a residence. They just didn't know exactly where. So they really didn't acquire a target, and so they couldn't just fire into the air. So the key was they were pinned down for an hour, and it was SRT that brought in the armored vehicle to help facilitate the rescue efforts. And again, there were so many other. We're still mulling through the complexity of this event. And so we know that there were other rescue efforts facilitated by first responding patrol officers.
Chief, one of the things that came out in this earlier was kind of a contradiction, that this man has a CPL and access to 7 weapons and yet has mental illness.
Again, we have found no documentation supporting that he's suffering from mental illness. Again, sometimes people talk, family members say something's not quite right. But there was no indication when we checked our records that he's been diagnosed with mental illness. That's why I'm very careful to say that. However, we do know that different events occur in people's lives and things change. But it is factored that he has 7 weapons registered and a CPL holder.
Chief, was the suspect dating a relative of
Yes.
the deceased? How did that work?
And we believe that's what started this whole incident. We don't know the circumstances. Also, according to the DPS officer, who is related to the victims and related to the suspect's girlfriend, that the relationship for the most part was uneventful.
And so no shots returned. You're still looking to wait him out? Is that roughly what you're telling us, Chief?
No, we're aggressively trying to determine what's going on inside of the residence. We're using technology to do that, so we're not waiting him out. In fact, I indicated that our last verbal contact with him was at 2 o'clock in the morning, and that was after we fired a third set of deployment of gas. He just, after we deployed the gas, he just closed the door. And that was our last contact. We have not had telephone contact with him. We have not seen movement. We were aware, or are aware, of several fires that were set inside of the location during the course of the night. And we determined that they were done to probably add warmth, that there's no heat in the location.
Are there other family members here?
Not that I'm aware of.
Chief, does having this big of a presence at the scene affect your ability to fight crime in other parts of the city?
This is a critical incident, and when we have a critical incident like this, all hands on deck. it's not a matter of the impact it's having on crime. It's about this community. We need to bring safety, order, and this is as it's been described. This is a very tragic situation, and it could have been a lot worse. We could have been talking about another dead officer, but fortunately it didn't happen. Certainly our prayers go out to the family of those who did die as a result of the injuries.
Chief, do you have anything on this woman who could be the third victim? Do we know anything about that and whether she's in the house, or do we know anything at all?
We have some information. I'm not in a place where I can disclose that right now because this is an active investigation, and we just want to bring some closure.
The woman who's missing, is this the suspect's girlfriend or just a family member?
Suspect's girlfriend, yes.
Suspect's girlfriend that's missing. And you said there was no heat in the house. Is that you guys turned off the
That's what I
gas?
was informed, that there is no heat, and several times during the course of the night, the suspect has lit fires. At one time it was believed he was trying to burn the house down, but that wasn't the case. He was just lighting fires to stay warm. But again, we have not seen any movement, and I think the last fire was set around that 2 o'clock hour. Does anyone know different on that? About 2 o'clock? Okay.
You had mentioned, you said three police officers in total were shot. One was the DPS officer. And two
DPS.
DPD.
Non-life-threatening injuries. All three were shot in the leg. All three were shot in the leg. Again, one is going to be released today, which is the DPD or DPS off-duty officer, and there was a DPD officer who has already been released, examined and released. Superficial wounds, some shrapnel to his, I believe it's his right leg, and then the one officer who was most seriously injured, who is going to stay in for at least another day. But again, non-life-threatening injury.
Thank you, Chief.
Okay, thank you. I think no, I guess that's your crew. Is that the crew that's already here? I thought somebody else.
The relief crew.
A
I
relief
think,
crew. Oh, I
probably.
see. Right.
So, any idea at this point, any kind of game plan about when you might breach the house or an attempt to enter? Do you see that happening in the next hour or later?
It could be. Again, we're using the technology. I'll just say it. We use robots to gain access. There's no secret that this suspect has shown violence, in any effort to make contact with him, he begins to fire shots. And again, these were officers and victims that were shot and down on the street, and he began to fire at them. So people were pinned down for at least an hour. So we know going in, we expect that it could be a very difficult situation.
You're not sure if it's maybe he's just laying in wait, or you're not sure what you're.
Well, based on his actions over the night, it's a very dangerous situation, and so we're going to take our time for sure and make sure that no one else gets hurt.
Chief, is that an MSP robot or a DPD?
MSP.
Is that the bomb squad that we saw? Is that
Bomb squad. We have robots as well. They have additional equipment, and so I'm glad that they're here because there's different equipment that can do different things. And so they have one that can go up into higher elevations inside of a residence, which is very important in this case.
I'm sorry, Chief Weaver, on the other hand, is that one Detroit police officer or is that a DPS officer that was shot?
An off-duty DPS officer and 2 DPD officers that were shot.
Chief, I'm looking at the team over there in the tank-looking vehicle. Looks like they're wearing much larger outfits than you normally see officers wear. Is there any thought that maybe that should be the new normal? That every officer should dress like that?
It's funny you would ask me that question. You know, as soon as we talk about armored vehicles and the officers clad in heavy protective gear, then we get accused of the militarization of our police department. So we want our officers to be safe. They do wear protective body armor, and the reason why our SRT officers wear a heavier duty outfit is because of the risk that they're exposed to. They're going into a risk situation, whereas our first responders, not that they're not in any less danger. Certainly we all know, given recent events, that they're probably in the most extreme danger. So there's some things we're talking about in terms of tactics in responding to these kind of situations. Again, I applaud the efforts of both the DPD, the MSP. Wayne County Sheriff's is also here assisting on an as-needed basis. When we're on events like this that go long hours, certainly we have to build in a relief effort.
Have you been able to make contact with the second suspect? I'm sorry if you may have already answered that question.
I did. There is no second suspect. We've determined that the suspect that we thought was a suspect was not. He was taken into custody, and he's going to be released. He was not involved in this incident at all.
Okay.